Hi, friends. So you've probably seen this clip I'm going to show by Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I'm just going to preface this with this is not an endorsement of Tulsi Gabbard. This is simply sharing something that I saw on her website, which is where she was talking to, or rather, an Afghan American woman was expressing her terrible frustration and dismay about the dreadful wars that were happening in their name, in the people's name, and how. And then she sort of went to a question which wasn't really answered in some ways by Tulsi Gabbard, but it was a question about what is Tulsi Gabbard going to do when, basically, she didn't put it this way, but what is Tulsi Gabbard going to do when there's so much opposition in the Democratic Party, and when, basically when the Democratic Party, the DNC, I'm assuming this is what she implied in this, that the DNC is going to try and rig the primary again against either Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. And maybe by that stage, Bernie Sanders might actually be ahead, and then he picks Tulsi Gabbard as a VP, and so basically it's a sabotage of both of them. I'm probably reading far too much into that question that woman said, but I'm actually I would like to know what Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders are going to do when the DNC does that to them again, because Bernie Sanders, the primary was stolen in 2016 by the DNC. They admitted it in a lawsuit that they have the right to pick whomever they want in back rooms smoking cigars. So really, what is the point in some ways of anybody voting in the primaries if they're going to decide, like, for example, if they're going to decide if Joe Biden is their Democratic nominee or Kamala Harris is their Democratic nominee, either one. It probably will be Kamala Harris, but maybe not. It could be Joe Biden, the neoliberal warmongering Joe Biden. So that is a real question that I don't see anybody asking her, Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders. I did see Fox News ask Bernie Sanders something like that. I think they were fairly straightforward when they asked him, what are you going to do if the DNC, steals a primary against you? And by the way, Bernie Sanders did not challenge, despite people pushing him to challenge in 2016 the stealing of the primary from him. He did not challenge it, which is really unfortunate. And then what was more unfortunate is he endorsed the warmonger Hillary Clinton. So, this is his last chance, and if he goes and does that again, well, that would be extremely unfortunate. Now, I'm not endorsing Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. They have problematic. Tulsi Gabbard is flying under the radar about Israel, and no one is pushing her on that. I think that's unfortunate because that's no small potatoes, a genocide of Palestinians, and also that the U.S. gives $10.5 million worth of military assistance every day to Israel. So they wouldn't, and also AIPAC dictates foreign policy to Congress people. So I don't think that that's anything that's small. It's as important as all these imperialist wars that Tulsi Gabbard says that she's against. She's for a drone program. I think that's incredibly problematic because drones kill more civilians than they do these so-called insurgents, and so forth. So it's all, for me, their foreign policy is problematic, and also that Tulsi Gabbard flies under the radar about Israel and no one is pushing her on that. That's unfortunate. But anyway, I'm just playing this particular segment about this Afghan-American woman who gets very upset about these imperialist wars because it's rare to even see anybody bring that up. Everybody's always focused on domestic policies and on Medicare for all and everything, and I can understand why when you live in a country that is probably the only Western country that is disgraceful at looking after their own people, that has an inverted totalitarian state, basically, as Chris Hedges calls it, or rather Sheldon Wolin originally called it. So I can understand why people focus on domestic things, but I mean, the absolute appalling things that are going on, by the U.S. empire, including this recent thing with Venezuela. And by the way, something that the mainstream media is completely ignoring is that 40,000 Venezuelans have died due to crippling U.S. economic sanctions. That is something that no mainstream media is talking about, and that is so appalling. I've got to find a new description. I always call things appalling when it comes to U.S. empire because they are. I've got to find some new adjectives, but really and truly, it's so appalling. 40,000 and not a mention from the mainstream media. And here's John Bolton going on about, the poor Venezuelans, we need to sort of rescue them from this dictator, in quotes, dictator Maduro. And yet, and here is, the U.S. with its crippling sanctions has killed 40,000 people. And look at this economic sanctions on Iraq in the early 90s. Madeleine Albright was asked, is 500,000 dead Iraqi children, was it worth it? And she said, yes, I think it's worth it. That's the U.S. empire in a nutshell. So, this whole nonsense, just remember that when you hear this humanitarian reasons and we care about the Venezuelan people and want to rescue them from this dictator Maduro. Excuse me, if he was a dictator, there would be Juan Guaido would be dead. So would Leopoldo Lopez, who helped him with that failed military coup yesterday. And there'd be a whole lot of dead protesters as well that are protesting against Maduro. But there aren't. And he isn't a dictator. That's just imperialist nonsense. And when I hear things like Ilhan Omar, who I admire for her standing up, being given death threats over and over again, when she says truthful things about AIPAC and truthful things about war and stuff, but when she says things like, yes, there needs to be free and fair elections in Venezuela, I think, why are you feeding into that imperialist nonsense? They have completely transparent elections in Venezuela, even if the Carter Group has backed away from their original statement about it, saying they had the best in the world. Literally, they said they have the best in the world, the Carter Group. They do. They do have the best in the world, far better than the U.S. So, we need to stop with these imperialist tropes like, that anybody who isn't a Western leader is somehow a dictator, or any country that the U.S. wants to overthrow, that the leader is a dictator and stuff. In some cases that might be true, but in the case of Venezuela, and also just remember that 73% of the dictators in the world are supported by the U.S. empire. There's so much hypocrisy, you couldn't, it's hard to wade through it. Talk about a swamp of hypocrisy. Or as Abby Martin says, there's an ocean of lies surrounding Venezuela, and I invite you to check out the Empire Files and her really amazing programs on Venezuela. TheEmpireFiles.tv. Just check that out. Anyway, I'm getting off the track about this particular segment I'm going to play you. It's only about 5 minutes long. This woman, the Afghan-American woman, who is very upset about what's happening in her own country, back home in Afghanistan, and also just the imperialist wars and how, it's all for resources and hegemony. And then she says, what are you going to do when the Democratic Party is you get more opposition from within your own party than you do outside of it, which is so true. What should that tell anybody about the Democratic Party, that they're actually pushing against someone who is claiming to be against war, that wants actually to end those imperialist wars and interventions? So she says, okay? Who knows what might happen when people get in, because people make all sorts of promises when they are running. But that's a good question, and that should be a question that anybody who is supporting either those candidates, Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard, should be actually looking into, pushing on them right now to say, what steps are you going to take, Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, when the Democratic Party, the DNC, during the primary, steals the primary vote from you? And what are you going to do when they do that? Because I don't believe that they're going to not do that to either of those people. Should they become, should they continue to be successful and have most of the popular vote. And Bernie Sanders, I think, I don't know if I actually explained fully when I said Bernie Sanders was asked by Fox News, what are you going to do? And if I can find the clip, I will. But he said something to the effect of, well, I've had discussions with them about this, something to that effect. He said, I've had discussions about this with them, and something to the effect of they're not going to be doing that. The fact that he even has to have discussions with the Democratic Party about not rigging the election for him again. How embarrassing is that? I mean, people should be so embarrassed that they have to do that. I mean, that should be enough to write that party off. Just that there. Rigging elections. And then, look at all that money that Bernie Sanders raised, and I think that went back into the DNC coffers. Is that going to happen again? See, there are things like that, holding them accountable right now for what they're going to do if that happens. I agree with Tulsi Gabbard when she says it's up to us, the public, and, it's about it. I think, she was sort of implying it's a grassroots movement. Yes, I actually think there is no leader that can actually save us from U.S. empire at this point. I don't think there's any leader. The only way we're going to save ourselves is with ourselves, by ourselves, and breaking the machine, as Chris Hedges said, in non-violent ways, but breaking the machine. People are going to vote, so... But the thing is, I don't think she really answered the question, and people need to push her on that. People need to push her on two things as far as I'm concerned. This is my personal opinion. They need to push her on how she keeps saying that there's targeted drone programs, and that you have only use it in specific cases. That's not good enough. There's lots of civilians killed, and who are you actually killing? Without any trials or anything from the sky. War is a crime. Specific instances of criminal activity, it's all part of just the whole thing. War is a crime. If war is a crime, and if people actually paid more, if they spent a lot of money for diplomacy, having diplomats going around instead of, and stop meddling in others' countries, there wouldn't be so much violence, would there? There's meddling everywhere, and I've showed you that meme that I've showed with all the countries that the U.S. has either tried to overthrow or has successfully overthrown. And I put Venezuela in that. I actually had Venezuela without an asterisk because I knew that they wouldn't be successful so far anyway, but I'm sure they're going to keep going with that. But anyway, the second thing, the first thing is push her on the drone program, Tulsi Gabbard. The second thing is push her, this is probably for me the most important thing, push her on, be really specific about Israel and say, if you became president of the United States or you're vice president or whatever, would you address the Israel lobby that is actually influencing foreign policy overseas, and it's having a tremendous effect on the push to have a war with Iran? But, would you address that AIPAC lobbying that's going on? And it's going on worldwide. It's happening here in Australia too, the Israel lobby. So that's another one that's really important because of Israel's influence on foreign policy. Talk about other governments countries meddling in foreign policy. Israel is the one, okay? The other thing about Israel, of course, is the $10.5 million a day. I'm talking about military aid, not actual dollars, since Israel is a sovereign economy. But I'm talking about the military support, the $10.5 million a day of military weapons and so forth. They have a big stockpile of weapons in Israel that the U.S. says they're leaving there, sort of like a stockpile, like a little stockpile of, not a little one, a big stockpile of weapons and military gear and stuff in Israel, and they can use it as well, So there's a lot of military support there because Israel is a partner in crime with the the manage chaos in the Middle East. They're partners in crime along with Saudi Arabia. So there's literally the axis of evil, the US empire, Saudi Arabia, that brutal monarchy, and apartheid Israel. So anyway, people need to push Tulsi Gabbard on that. Be really specific about those things. Is she going to support that ongoing $10.5 million in military aid, etc., and other sorts of support every day to Israel, and also about AIPAC? Because she's flying under the radar, and if you watch the 2015 speech she gave to the Christians United for Israel, which is a really right-wing fascist Christian group, where she pledges complete support to Israel and all of that, watch that and ask her, has she turned about on that? Is she rejected that position she had in 2015? There's only like three or so years ago she had that position. Watch that. Just check on YouTube, and you can see that speech she gave. She even calls it a battle of ideologies, and that sort of makes me wonder about her position on Muslims and stuff. It's not that there are Christians and Muslims or Palestinians, but it's all sort of, people need to push her on that. She's flying under the radar, and I'm sorry if people get upset with any sort of critique of Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders or anybody who they, but we have to stop looking at these people like they're some sort of kind of semi-gods or something, that they're, we have to stop putting people on pedestals. They're politicians. They're actually supposed to be public servants. They're not supposed to be people that the public are afraid to question. People have to stop sort of treating them this way. They're politicians. They're supposed to be public servants. They're not supposed to be our leaders. They're not supposed to be oligarchs. They're not supposed to be rulers. And people are supposed to hold their feet to the fire. They're not going to become more ethical once they get into office. That doesn't happen. Politicians don't become more ethical when they get into office. So if you don't push them now, you can forget about it. You have to push these people from the left. I really, really think it's so far gone now. I think it wouldn't matter who got in. And if they were really pro-peace, they wouldn't last. As William Bloom, the historian, said, if he became president and he started reversing all these imperialist wars, on the 5th day he would be assassinated. I sort of feel like that's where it's at now. The US empire is so far gone, and it's so desperate now and dangerous because it sees that it's falling. It sees that the world is becoming multipolar and isn't unipolar anymore, that they're not the top bully of the world anymore. They're trying to be, but everybody is coalescing because they're tired of being bullied. Everybody is grouping together and aligning with China and Russia and trying to find ways to get around these sanctions on Iran and oil, like India and other countries now are finding ways to get around these awful sanctions on Iran, which are really hurting those people. And I don't know if it's hurting Iranians like it's hurt Venezuelans, but 40,000 Venezuelans are dead because of US empire's crippling economic sanctions. Remember that when people talk about Venezuela and start dumping on Venezuela. So anyway, this is the things we have to push people on, push Tulsi Gabbard on Israel, and push Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders on what exact steps they're going to take when the DNC steals the primary from them. Because the DNC and the Democratic Party, that warmongering, awful party, neoliberal party that doesn't care about the people, they would rather lose to I believe they'd actually rather lose to Trump than have any kind of remote progressive in a position of power. They've proven that they'd rather lose to a GOP candidate in these various state-run things than they would having a progressive in. So that tells you a lot, all you need to know really about the Democratic Party. So, you can guarantee they're going to try and steal the primary from Tulsi Gabbard and or Bernie Sanders. They're going to do that. So you have to push them on what they're going to do, what exact steps they're going to do. Because if they don't have any plan, that means they might just sort of relent once again. Bernie Sanders will say, okay, and just start promoting whatever awful candidate they have, if it's Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. So prepare to be incredibly disappointed if you haven't got an answer from those two about what exact things they're going to do when the DNC steals the primary from them again. I'm sorry, I just sort of feel like, it's like not having a second parachute when you jump out of a plane. If you haven't got a plan, if you haven't pushed them on it, what plan they're going, what actions they're going to take when the Democratic Party do them over. It's like not having a second parachute in a way. It's not like not even having a first parachute, really. It doesn't matter how popular Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard is if they're going to steal the primary, is there? Anyway, that's really all I was going to say, but I was so glad to see somebody from the public actually talking about these imperialist wars that make other countries suffer for resources and hegemony. And it's sad that it had to be an Afghan American who was doing that. I would like to see everybody sort of talking about that to Bernie Sanders, to every candidate that's running anywhere, and including state, whoever is in Congress. People should be pushing them over and over and over again, not focusing just on domestic policies. There are people's lives at stake in these imperialist wars. There's 1 million dead Iraqis now, over 1 million dead, from that war on lies. The weapons of mass destruction didn't exist, and George W. Bush knew it. So did Colin Powell. And now 1 million Iraqis are dead, and they've destroyed that country. It'll probably never recover. These are really serious things. So we have to care about what happens with these imperialist wars. There's no anti-war movement to speak of in my own country, in Australia. There's hardly anybody sticking up for Julian Assange. Today, there's an extradition, a court about his extradition. There was a good protest last night at his court hearing about his bail jumping, so-called jumping bail, and he explained why he did that. But they actually gave him 50 weeks, which is, it's sort of like, it's 2 weeks short of the maximum sentence, which doesn't bode well. It means that that particular judge was very biased. Is sort of, if this is what's going to happen when it comes to his extradition, the court about his extradition to the US, that's really, really frightening. And this is in the UK. So that extradition, that court about his extradition is coming up today in the UK. So keep an eye out on that, but it doesn't look good, because if they give him 50 weeks in that Belmarsh prison, which is an awful prison, and there was some guy who killed somebody in his speedboat, and he got 6 months. He didn't turn up. He didn't turn up to court, but he got 6 months. That's somebody who killed somebody, manslaughter, in a speedboat, and Julian Assange gets 50 weeks. So anyway, it's very, very sad. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to Julian Assange now. And I think that his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, is very concerned. You could see it on her face outside that court hearing, because that sentence was very extreme. So anyway, that's all I was going to say. So I'm going to play this for you now, this just in case you haven't seen it. It's probably been around the different sites now for the last 2 or 3 days. It came out. I was going to do a video on this about a couple of days ago, but then this whole failed coup happened in Venezuela, and I got sidetracked. But anyway, so I hope that people will push these candidates on what they're going to do when the primary is stolen from them. Anyway, so thanks so much for watching. Please click the like button if you like the content. Please hit the subscribe button, and definitely click the notifications bell. Otherwise, you won't receive notifications when I drop a video. Please join at Vegan Trove on YouTube. And because I don't always post everything that I do elsewhere on the net, certain sites, so you won't miss any videos if you are subscribed to Faint Signals from Vega on YouTube. Okay, so thanks so much for watching. Till next time, bye for now.
thank you for talking against war. Thank you for bringing up the fact that Yemen is paying for what is going on in between the Saudi and the US. And I, as an Afghan American, have seen the effect of war. The Cold War that started in the 70s and 80s in between the Soviets and America, Afghans are still paying for it. All that being said, when you are talking about the fact that you are against war and you are against our foreign policies, I get very excited and I get very hopeful and I get tearful. But I also feel very hopeless. Why I feel hopeless? Because our system, our foreign policy is built in a way that we thrive when other people fail in the other part of the world. We had Bernie Sanders and we all were so excited that maybe he will bring a change. But his own party stopped him from doing that. Tulsi, I'm all for you. And I hope that I'm going to stand on those polls and vote for you in 2020, hoping that you will.
Who will make the change, who will bring the change, who will be the voice for the voiceless, who will be the person who can say that the war that we start here, the billions of dollars that we are spending on this war can go to our addicts, to the mental health, to our health care here in the States. People are dying of poverty. And yet people are dying of poverty in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in parts of Africa, because we have started those wars. Tulsi, how are you going to fight your own party, our own Democrats? How?
Yes.
No more wars.
No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars. No more wars.
Thank you for sharing your heart with all of us. You speak for so many whose voices are not being heard. You have just laid out why I'm running for president. This is not a political ambition that I have had for myself. With the obstacles that are in place and the challenges that exist, it is because of the people that you're talking about, people whose lives are being impacted, that make me work tirelessly to run for president to bring about this change. We're not naive to the challenges that lay before us, or the obstacles that are placed ahead of us, or the smear tactics that are used against us. Yes, it's coming from within our own party. The most attacks I get are not from Republicans. They're from Democrats. They're from people in the mainstream media. They're from people in the foreign policy establishment that you're talking about, people who represent the interests of the military-industrial complex. But you know what? You know what? The answer to how we overcome this, it's us. It's we the people. The stronger they come, the stronger we respond. And you know what? We don't respond to their dirty tactics or their hate with more hate. We respond with strength and love and our message of peace and humanity. We cannot lose faith in the power that we hold within our own hands, our own feet, our own voices, and our hearts. It is only when we reclaim our own voices and our own power in dictating the change in this country that we need to make that we can be successful. People will get into a lot of conversations about political tactics and how do we win this race and who's going to beat Donald Trump. Bluntly, I might get in trouble for saying this, what does it matter if we beat Donald Trump if we end up with someone who will perpetuate the very same crony capitalist policies, corporate policies, and waging more of these costly wars? This is why I'm running for president. This is not a joke. This is not for fun. This is not about me. It's about all of us. It's about our future. Making sure that we have one. I ask for all of your support. I ask you to stand shoulder to shoulder with me in this movement for peace abroad, peace at home, so that we can fight for that path towards a bright future with opportunity and justice, equality, and respect for all.